welcome to our webinar, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror in the Era of Mass Incarceration, hosted by the Catholic Apostolate Center in collaboration with the National Black Catholic Congress. I'm Alex Cranston, the production coordinator for the Catholic Apostolate Center, and I'll be your host this afternoon as we welcome our guest speakers, Father Dustin Feddon and Mariah Morrison. Father Dustin is a priest of the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee, serving at St. Teresa's Parish and in pastoral ministry to those incarcerated throughout North Florida. And Mariah is the senior social worker at the Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit human rights organization focused on ending mass incarceration, and is a PhD candidate in social work at Washington University in St. Louis. We're pleased to have both of them speaking with us. At the end of the presentation, Father Dustin and Mariah will be available for some questions and answers. If throughout the presentation you have any questions you would like to ask our presenters, please send them in the Q&A box and we will answer all of the questions that we can. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, please send me a message in the chat box on the bottom right hand of the screen, and I'll be sure to help you out as much as I can. I'll now turn things over to Father Dustin and Mariah.
And I'm here with Father Dustin.
Hello.
So we're very happy to be speaking with you today with the NBCC. It's a real privilege for us to be able to present today. Today we wanted to talk some about our experiences over the past about 10 years that we've both been serving the incarcerated, and kind of the journey that we've been on, and the understanding that we have arrived at or are in the process of in understanding how to best serve incarcerated people and address a really overwhelming public health concern known as mass incarceration. The title of our presentation today is Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror in the Era of Mass Incarceration. And what we're going to talk with you about today is, again, our experiences going into prisons and coming to try to understand the lives of incarcerated people. And in this process, having come to realize that it is not possible for us to understand the lives of incarcerated people without understanding the history of racial terror in the United States, and how, as the director of the Equal Justice Initiative, Bryan Stevenson, has said, that slavery in the United States did not end in 1865. It has evolved, and it has evolved over time as a narrative of racial difference, which has come to infect the criminal justice system in the United States. So I'm going to show you a series of slides that are primarily photographs. One of the things we want to do is give you a visual understanding of the lives of incarcerated people, where we hold people in prison, what these places look like and feel like to be in, and to also just provide you with some of the kind of basic numbers and facts about the state of incarceration in the United States today. So again, this term mass incarceration is a relatively new term. It's a new way of conceptualizing what has happened in our criminal justice system over the past 4 decades. In 1972, there were approximately 300,000 people in U.S. prisons and jails. But today, there are 2.3 million. While in the United States, the population is approximately 17% African American, in our prisons, the population is 56% African American. So there's a horrendous racial disparity within this system, and it's important to explore the reasons for that, both for an understanding of mass incarceration, but again also for understanding the individual lives of the people that we are serving. So the U.S. has a particularly punitive criminal justice system. We have about 5% of the world's population in the U.S., but we have a quarter of the world's prisoners. 1 in 20 American adults will spend time in jail or prison. And these mass incarceration does not affect people in the United States evenly. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics just a few years ago released these numbers that 1 in 3 black male babies born today are expected to go to jail or prison in their lifetime. And I'm going to show you a little bit more to illustrate the disparities. So this slide shows a couple of photographs from prisons in Alabama. The one on the left is the women's prison in Alabama. And I included these slides because I wanted to give you a sense of the ways that people are warehoused in these facilities and the really impoverished conditions within these facilities. Both of these prisons have been under federal scrutiny, subject to various lawsuits because of the horrendous conditions in these places. But you can see that people are just stacked on top of each other, kept in these very tight quarters. This is the extent of their personal space. And for some of these men and women, this is where they will spend the rest of their lives. Some men and women spend decades in these places. They have a bed and a bag to keep their things in, and this is the extent of their space. And you can imagine that in a space this crowded, that safety is a significant issue in these facilities. Going back to talking about the distribution of incarceration in the United States and the ways it affects different communities differently, I put together these two maps. One, the blue one shows the incarceration rate in the United States, and the red one shows the poverty rate in the United States, where the darker colors are where there's higher concentrations, and you can see that there is a strong overlap between poverty and incarceration. And if we were to break it down further by county level, by city level, you would see further disparities. This is a photograph of, again, a prison in Alabama. This is considered their infirmary. So this is where people with medical needs or who are medically vulnerable are housed. And you can see also quite horrible conditions in these places and the difficulty that people in poor health have in these facilities. Incarcerated people are an under-researched population, but the research that does exist, a lot of which comes out of lawsuits, shows that the health of incarcerated people is far worse in numerous domains than for people in when you work in prisons, you come to use this language, but in the free world or free society, even when controlling for socioeconomic factors, health among people in prisons is significantly worse. And in most of these facilities, there is not adequate medical care. Only 17% of medical providers within prisons in the United States are accredited, which means that there's very low quality care provided. People are not able to get the care that they need, and they die much earlier. And again, this is just some numbers about the health issues for incarcerated people. Again, these are dangerous places. People are frequently injured. Suicide is very high in these facilities, and understandably so. They are places of despair. Rates of substance use disorders are also very high, as well as mental illness. And part of this is the result of political priorities in the United States in terms of where resources are being directed, there was a movement about 40 years ago to shut down state mental hospitals, which was done in a spirit of benevolence. These were considered terrible places for people with mental illness, with the hope of transitioning them to the community so that they could receive services in the community. Unfortunately, we have shut down state facilities without also opening up the community centers to provide care for people with serious mental illness, and many have ended up in prison. Prisons have come to be the jails and prisons in the United States are the largest mental health providers, and the quality of care is quite low. We also, because of the types of sentencing that has become increasingly popular in the United States, tough on crime policies have led to much longer sentences than we had ever seen before. Mass incarceration is not only a problem of too many people in prison, but it's people staying in prison too long. And so we have people aging in prison, and this is again, we are burdening prisons with so many issues that prisons are unequipped to deal with, including having an aging population. So we have had this 550% increase in the number of older adults since 1990, as people get older, they're far more vulnerable to victimization within prisons. They're a very vulnerable population. This is a client of the Equal Justice Initiative. I imagine that some of our audience has read Bryan Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. And this is Joe Sullivan, who is featured in one of the stories that Bryan tells. Joe was 13 in Pensacola, Florida, when he was arrested and charged with a sexual offense and sentenced to life without parole. Joe is my age, he's 43, and Joe has, since that time, maintained his innocence. And Joe was sentenced to life without parole and really tossed into these adult prisons where he had, as you can imagine, no ability to protect himself, and ended up spending a lot of his time in prison in solitary confinement. Joe has intellectual challenges, and as you can see from this photograph, he also has a number of physical disabilities. Many of these challenges that Joe has have worsened in his time in prison and developed at a much faster rate than we think would have otherwise because of the extraordinary stress and the impoverished conditions in which he was living. We took Joe's case on in 2007, and we were able to get him released last year. Now, we unfortunately have never been able to prove Joe's innocence because the state destroyed the physical evidence in Joe's case before we took his case. And Joe was tried at a time prior to DNA testing being available. We are confident from our own review of Joe's trial and the records available that had we had the DNA evidence, we would have been able to prove Joe's innocence. Without that, however, Joe must abide by very strict standards known as the sex offender registration requirements that is different in every state, but quite burdensome, and have limited where we can provide housing to Joe, where Joe can spend his time during the day, and the access Joe has to the essential medical care that he needs. So this kind of is transitioning a little bit into talking some more about EJI services and the work that Dustin and I do together. Dustin and I both have spent a lot of time working with people who are incarcerated, and then also seeing that when it is time for their release, that they are being so often dropped out into a world in which they have no resources, and not only no resources, but enormous barriers to gaining access to really the basic material necessities that, of life. And so Dustin and I have been working together for some months now on developing programming to provide support services to people going through the transition that Joe Sullivan is in the process of going through. And Dustin will talk some more about that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about our work with juveniles also. So among the populations that are vulnerable under current conditions of mass incarceration are really our most vulnerable members of society, and that includes children. Children who are least able to manage a very complicated system, and these are some of the kids that we have worked with who have faced adult prosecution, and this is another area in which we see extraordinary racial bias. Once kids are transferred up to the adult court, children of color are far more likely to get an adult sentence, and the sentences are far more likely to be much longer. In the top left corner, that is Ashley Jones. She is the client who really inspired EJII's work on behalf of children sentenced to life without parole, like Joe Sullivan. It was Ashley writing to us that led us to find Joe Sullivan. Ashley wrote to us. She was 14 when she was sentenced to life without parole, and that began our campaign to both understand what is happening to children in the adult system and to begin advocating for fair treatment for children. This is some more photographs of the insides of prisons. This is a solitary confinement unit in Alabama, one of the Alabama prisons. There are currently, I would say, probably more than 84,000 people in solitary confinement in the U.S. These are the regions of the prison that Father Dustin spends most of his time in, speaking to men who are confined to a bathroom or closet-sized cells with very little what they call property. In prison, your belongings are called your property, and you're very limited in what you are allowed to have. And you're kept within these walls for at least 23 hours a day. And it varies by state to state and prison to prison how long you're actually in these rooms, but these periods of time in solitary go on for years, sometimes decades. And Dustin and I both have worked with people who have spent decades never having left these rooms and having very restricted lives. Again, and some more images of the insides of prisons, the extraordinary idleness inside of these places, the warehousing of people, the anonymity of people within these facilities. And I think the more you understand the conditions inside prisons, the more you understand that these places are not benefiting us in terms of our public safety. These are not places that people go and come out better off. They go and they accumulate damage, and then upon returning to society, 95% of the people you see in these photos will return to society at some point, and most will return to nothing and no one. and will need to construct a life from there, and that in no way does any favors to public safety. This is the last slide I'm going to show, and this slide I think is important because of the reminder it offers that the burden of incarceration, mass incarceration, falls heaviest on children. And not even just the children who are being arrested, but the children who are left behind when parents are taken to prison, and the trauma of that, both emotionally but also financially, the shame that is placed on these children because of the situations that their parents are in, and we know from studies of the families and children of incarcerated people that it has a very detrimental effect economically, educationally, on children. That was my last slide. So I thought we could transition now to including Father Dustin in the conversation. So Father Dustin and I met a couple of years ago, and at the Equal Justice Initiative, which I encourage everyone to make a trip to visit us in Montgomery. We recently opened our Legacy Museum, which looks at the evolution of slavery into mass incarceration. And we also opened the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, in which we memorialize victims of racial terror lynchings in the United States. Both very powerful places to spend time in and to reflect on our history. Father Dustin came to meet with us after his experiences in the prisons and reading Just Mercy, and we began to talk about our work with incarcerated people. And when he came and talked to me about working as a prison minister and going into the solitary confinement units, my response was to just marvel at the unique and privileged access that Dustin has to these places. I go into prisons all the time, but I'm restricted generally to a visitation room or to some sort of office where my client is shackled and seated several feet from me, either behind plexiglass or behind a table. But Dustin is actually able to go into these spaces where the men are housed, to see the conditions firsthand, to be with the men in these places. And one of the things that I frequently say to Dustin when he is going into these places is that he is, so often for the men there, he is the sole source of human light and compassion in these places. And I think his presence in these places is immeasurably valuable. I think also, as Dustin and I have talked about, his work inside prisons, we've talked about the importance of him understanding his role as witness. So much of what happens inside prisons is left in the realm of the invisible and the unspeakable. And especially for people returning from incarceration, there is such a weight of shame for what they have experienced inside of these places that it is very hard to get to the stories of the lives inside of these places. And so much in terms of the public discourse about prisons rarely gets to what is the human experience inside of prisons. And so I wanted to kind of bring Father Dustin into the conversation by reminding him of stories he's told me when he's come out of his visits to these prisons. And this summer in Alabama and Florida, as is typical, we have heat indexes above 100. It's scorching hot and humid. and uncomfortable for those of us who can go in and out of air conditioning all day. But I wanted to just invite Father Dustin to talk about his experiences going into these places this past summer.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mariah. Thank you, NBCC, as well, for providing us with this opportunity to share our experiences. Mariah with Equal Justice Initiative, and myself as a Catholic priest in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee. And I should just say at the beginning that, you know, in our diocese we have about 40,000 incarcerated in a state that has close to 100,000, if not over 100,000, incarcerated men and women in many of the types of facilities that we've just seen on these slideshows and these slides. My experience of going into these facilities, in particular facilities that are large solitary confinement camps, which was the image that Mariah showed earlier, is kind of indicative of my experience of solitary confinement holding cells. Facilities that I go to, one in particular, houses about 1,000 men in solitary confinement, in those essentially those kind of the size of a bathroom, what resembles kind of a mop closet, really. And there men spend hours upon hours of their days sitting, standing, lying down, with hardly anything really to do. And in my experience in going in, so you walk in through these multiple different gates, and you kind of come upon this, you know, a large kind of campus area, and you see massive dorms where, again, over 1,000 men are being essentially warehoused, and are simply in holding for, as Mariah mentioned, it could be for decades, or it could be for, you know, a year and a half that they stay at these facilities. And when I walk in, I mean, it's as I'm sure some of the participants have witnessed in working in prisons, you see a lot of concrete and you see a lot of steel. And you hear just a lot of noise, the volume of noise of things clinking and doors shutting and people screaming. I mean, every time I go, you hear screams and people shouting, and you hear laughter, and you hear people screaming, you know, at the guards screaming at inmates. And so there's just a lot of noise. And you're aware that there's a lot of and you know, there's just not a way of understating or of overstating the degree of misery that you hear and you witness in these facilities. So when I walk in, and I remember my first experiences going into actually on death row and into solitary confinement areas, in particular in solitary confinement, just how many young Black faces I saw. And to me, that was, I didn't even know how to process it. To look through these windows in these doors, and overwhelmingly, 90%, I would say, of the faces that I would see were young African-American men. And it's just overwhelming. And I think, you know, just that experience itself testifies to an unconscionable injustice that, in particular, African-American communities are experiencing in the state of mass incarceration. And, you know, as I get closer to the windows, I see an individual, and oftentimes, you know, I'll engage in conversation, you know, very ordinary conversations. I've made it a point of my work that I have no interest in proselytizing. I'm not there to proselytize. I am there, as Mariah said, to witness, to give witness to their life as a human being, created in the image of God. And when I engage in conversations, the stories that I hear vary. You know, and just some of the stories that I'd like to share with you. One in particular is a young man, about 30 years old, who's serving a life sentence. And his name is Zachariah, a young African-American man who I actually met at the beginning of the summer, this past summer. And immediately, you know, Zachariah was interested in engaging in conversation and talking, and not only just talking, but Zachariah immediately was asking me about who I am, you know, what am I doing here, you know, what do I think about this or that or whatever. And eventually, as the conversation kind of continued, and actually over the span of a few visits, different days, Zachariah started talking to me about how he has kind of interpreted his own life. By the way, speaking of Zachariah, someone who really had minimal education, and probably, I think it's safe to say, kind of taught himself how to read, or at least to read books and novels and articles, and he's actually quite well read, but really from his own initiative. And Zachariah started talking to me about how he was interested in this book on the rites of passage of males who were slaves in the 18th and 19th centuries. And he kind of launched off from his kind of recollection of this book to talking about how, you know, really as a young Black man, I had my own rites of passage that I realize are probably the norm for most African-American men in poor communities, poor urban and rural communities, where Zachariah went on to say, you know, you go through these different rites of passages, such as leaving your home and going out onto the streets, joining a gang, having confrontations with law enforcement, addictions, drugs, alcoholism, eventually an arrest, and then incarceration. And for Zachariah, in saying all of that, gangs, violence, confrontation with law enforcement, incarceration, he was telling me that this is the status quo, that he never imagined a world in which he would not become incarcerated. And this is really, I think, what I credit, at least, you know, Bryan Stevenson and among others, and the work that they do at Equal Justice Initiative, with really putting a kind of a historical context on what can otherwise just become kind of this overwhelming, you know, structure of mass incarceration. But when we historicize it, we realize that not only are there these buildings that are prisons, physical sites, but that there's a culture of incarceration. And what Zachariah was telling me was that even before he was arrested, he was more or less incarcerated. That is, that he was kind of you know, almost as in a current, in a stream, into which it was simply inevitable that he would find himself in prison. And that is not uncommon in the conversations I hear. I hear of so many stories of young men, young Black men, that grew up where violence was the norm. Gunshots were frequent. I'm thinking of a young guy named Cedric, who's also serving not a life sentence, but I think up to about 40 years in prison. And when Cedric started telling me about his childhood, you would think that he grew up on the streets of Mosul or Damascus, somewhere in the Middle East, and watching his father gunned down, really in a war zone, watching an innocent woman shot and killed in front of him near his arcade, where he was, as a child, he would go to this arcade to play video games, and it was there that he witnessed extraordinary violence that, God forbid, anyone has to witness that you might imagine people are witnessing at a frequent level in war zones, but not in the streets in our neighborhoods here in America. And Sedgwick, was telling me all of this, and he was more or less telling me, what I heard him telling me was, I never had a chance. I never had a chance for a normal life. I never had a chance really for an education, for a possibility of living a life that was not so enveloped in this degree of violence. And yes, there are people that are the exceptions that get out of that culture. But I think what we have to focus on are all of the lives of people that are literally trapped, young and old, men and women of all color. But in particular, in my experience, going into these camps, these enormous facilities, and seeing a sea of blackness behind bars, to me, it is very overwhelming that there is a grave social injustice when it comes to the degree in which men of color are and find themselves incarcerated. And over time, I've realized that these stories, I hear a lot of stories of misery, of poverty, but I also am, and I know Mariah is struck by this as well in her experience with working with men and women that are incarcerated, and I'm sure some of those that are listening here as well have experienced this. I'm so taken at times witnessing the truth of their dignity, their resilience, their commitment to be compassionate in the midst of so much violence, to yearn for a normal life, that the dreams are being dreamt in these facilities in horrific conditions. These men are still able to dream of a normal life. And I know this is something that we'll talk about and here in a little bit, just about how that looks, or maybe we'll talk about it now in terms of that's one experience inside these facilities. Then we have to talk about, at some point, what happens post-incarceration, when men and women leave these gates, what their lives look like.
Right. And I think the point that Father Dustin was just making about how the men that we encounter in prison continue to dream, continue to have aspirations for their lives, is part of how we came to have a program that Dustin and I are developing called Joseph House. So we chose Joseph as the primary figure to in this model that we're building because of Joseph's dreams, and that these are men who are continuing to dream, and that we wanted to offer some foundation for those dreams, some way for them to return to society, or really for most of them, because incarceration starts so young for so many men, it begins in late adolescence. They've never even really had a chance to begin adulthood. So providing the platform for that is just how we see the model that we're developing in Joseph House, which is a place for building of dreams and for the men, and then a model that's also based on Pope Francis's call for us to accompany the people on the peripheries. And so we also see Joseph House as a model of accompaniment, where, and this is a model that we built also at EJI, using different concepts and language, but it is the same thing. We walk with the men and women leaving prison through each step of their return to society, so that they don't have to do this alone, so that the many barriers that they are encountering, we can be there with them, and experiencing a lot of it with them, and facing the stress and the often the sense of despair at so many doors being closed to them.
And this is something that Mariah and I embarked upon really this summer. We welcomed and started working. I actually visited him in solitary confinement, a young man named Quandarius, and I started kind of visiting him there in solitary confinement, and then we made the decision that because he was essentially going to be homeless at a young age, leaving a facility like that, he was going to be left at a bus station really to fend for himself. And that is not exceptional either. That happens frequently all over the country. One thing that Mariah and I have found in this experience with Quandarius is just what parishioners can do, and the degree to which the church can mediate a safe reentry into our society. And there were two parishioners in Tallahassee, Bryan and Sonia, who met Quandarius at the bus station. By the way, Bryan and Sonia, neither of them ever had any experience in prisons or visiting inmates. And they picked up Quan at the bus station, welcomed him back into society, took him out to eat at a Golden Corral, and then took him to a bookstore and had a normal, everyday conversation. And that meant the world to Quandarius and began the process of a safe reentry. This is something that Mariah and I are committed to with Joseph House, is reaching out and facilitating opportunities for parishioners, for churches, for parishes, really for people of goodwill to contribute in being bridges from prison, from confinement, from the conditions that we've talked about, back into society. And so that, I know we'll take time for a few questions here, Alex, but perhaps this is something we'll come back to here in a second, what we can do, what you all can do in this effort. So.
Yeah. Should we?
Alex?
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have a few questions. The first question, which I guess you guys were planning on alluding to, is what is something that the everyday person could do in their home parish?
Sure, and so these last few slides, we kind of wanted to cover this, just sort of a few different ways to approach this. First of all, I strongly recommend you listen to a speech by Bryan Stevenson. You can just find that on YouTube anywhere. He's incredibly inspiring in helping us think about how do we approach this issue, become involved in countering the forces that have allowed mass incarceration to develop. And so we start with this slide that get to know an incarcerated person, get to know the prisons in your area, get to know the courts in your area. Just go and see what's happening. Bryan talked about this as the importance of proximity, of being proximate, close. He's always talked about get closer, and that it's possible to schedule a tour out of prison. A lot of times, classes from universities will take tours. You can see the insides of these places. But another wonderful thing to do is to become a pen pal, and that's something that Dustin and I are able to arrange. People contact us all the time wanting to both because they're incarcerated and they would like contact with someone on the outside, and vice versa. Someone on the outside would like to provide support to an incarcerated person, and wonderful friendships have developed through writing, through letter correspondence. But also familiarizing yourself with it's not obvious to everyone how the criminal justice system is a biased system, how it is a system that is more harmful to the poor, more harmful to people of color, how we criminalize things now that 40 years ago we did not criminalize, how other countries do not criminalize these things. And so you can read books like Bryan's book, Just Mercy, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, Becoming Miss Burton, and a book that we meant to include but that just came out this summer by Anthony Ray Hinton, The Sun Does Shine. He was is a client of the Equal Justice Initiative, spent 30 years on death row and then was exonerated and released, that talks about his experiences surviving that. EJI has a wonderful website, lots of information, and again, I encourage you to come and visit us. And then this idea of accompaniment. If there is not in your parish or whatever community you're part of, if there is not an outreach ministry or group, it's always possible to form one. If you, the other thing is, like Bryan and Sonia, Father Dustin's friends in Tallahassee, who had no particular training in anything to do with anything. You know, Sonia is a professor. Bryan is a
accountant.
Yeah, is a business person. But their skills, their extension of friendship is so meaningful. And there are all kinds of professional services. We had an eye doctor. An eye doctor donate services to Quan, so the Quan was able to get glasses. We've had other clients who've needed dental work and had dentists donate services. Donating your skill is so important. You have doctors who will donate their services. And then also to be in the practice of welcoming. So again, one of the just chronic frustrations and sources of panic for those of us who do accompany people in the reentry process, for people who are coming out of prison, is access to housing and work, because we tend to categorically reject people with criminal records. And we would say that as Catholics, we would like to be welcoming to people, that we would at least offer an interview to someone rather than categorically rejecting them based on a criminal record, that we offer them an opportunity to present themselves, to become a full person to us, who we can then decide yes or no, do we want to engage this person.
Yeah, and I think also, just real quick, Alex, that the one cannot kind of ignore, at least within our kind of parish communities, our faith tradition, the degree to which reflecting on, praying for the incarcerated. I would even encourage many of those listening to reflect or to listen more, even to the liturgy and to the scriptures that we have on a daily, weekly basis. So when you hear the words freeing those that are captive, setting the captives free, bringing the gospel, the good news of justice and mercy and goodness and love and compassion to those that are poor, there's so much within our tradition that speaks of the incarcerated and those that are oppressed. And I think just the more that we're aware and reflect on it, I believe that the Holy Spirit, in many ways, will guide us and lead us to not only seeing and hearing, but acting as well. So,
great. Let me ask a few more questions that people have submitted. What can we do to help the children of the incarcerated?
Well, I think that this is definitely an invisible group to a certain extent within our communities, and I think that we can do things to counteract the children's experiences of shame around this by providing education around the reasons that our communities look the way that they do, the reasons that we have mass incarceration, which that is sort of like a theme throughout all of our services, is that knowing why these things are happening are very important to both for those of us serving the incarcerated, for the incarcerated, and for the children of the incarcerated, so that we can remove the shame that is so burdening communities and children. Now, the needs of incarcerated children, the children of the incarcerated, I think are numerous and in many different areas. So, when I think about in Alabama, the services that are available for the children, for example, of mothers who are incarcerated, that there are homes where these children go, foster homes for the children of incarcerated mothers. And there's organizations that do try to help maintain the relationships between the children and the mothers and the fathers by coordinating visits. I think that children have a range of material needs. Poverty is a very serious issue for children of the incarcerated. And I think there's just numerous settings in which these children are showing up, and that their needs are different, and their needs do need to be recognized, and the shame that they are carrying is one of the first things that must be addressed by helping them understand the larger context of the world that they live in, and then helping them build that relationship with that incarcerated parent if that's appropriate, and then providing them with the various material needs that they have.
Great. So we'll do probably the last. These are going to be our probably last two questions. This one is from Donna, and she asks, what might the Catholic Church do about our neighbors who are our landlords who may be interested in housing a former prisoner, but what could we do about neighbors who object to having a former prisoner living in their neighborhood?
That's a great question, and this is something that Mariah and I have already, not to that extent, but witnessed. Again, just another degree of the effects of incarceration is in many ways the denial or the looking the other way when those that were formerly incarcerated come looking for quality housing. There's a lot of discrimination, essentially, with them in trying to find quality housing. One thing I would say is forging relationships, and this is something that we're trying to do, and I know some people that I've been talking with in Tallahassee, Florida, are trying to do, which is we, the church, can become their advocates, and not only engaging in relationships with the neighbors of those who have questions or concerns. I would say, if you can, create an opportunity to accompany those that are formerly incarcerated in a conversation with a future landlord or with the neighbors. That's a way in which we as a church can humanize. Not only are we humanizing the men and women that are coming out of prison, but we're humanizing those that may be tempted to discriminate them. We're giving them an opportunity to act justly, to act like a normal, good human being by welcoming their sister or brother back into society. So I think that there's no probably formula to this other than the proximity thing that Mariah mentioned, quoting Bryan Stevenson. Get proximate to the situation, create opportunities for conversations and opportunities for meetings between those that are coming out of incarceration and those that are our landlords or neighbors. So,
our last question is, how can we help those who are in positions of power within the correction system, whether they're politicians or down to correction officers? How can we help them to best discharge their duties to society and responsibilities to their charges?
Well, I think that I hate to keep repeating ourselves, but it is the conversation. people in positions of power to get to know formerly incarcerated people, and to sort of decrease that sense of fear. And I think that for those working within the prisons, they are being tasked with an overwhelming responsibility. They are being tasked with keeping safe a group of people in an incredibly unsafe environment. And they're often not given all of the kind of tools that they need to be able to carry out their work. And so what I would say is, we need to decrease the population of prisons so that prison guards can do their jobs. They're too crowded. There's too many people. There's not enough resources. And if we want corrections officers to be able to do their jobs, we have to decrease the numbers of people in prisons. So we have to encourage parole boards to release people on parole. And we have to encourage judges and prosecutors to consider other measures aside from incarceration for dealing with the range of social issues that we are using the court system and prisons to manage. So I think that's what I would. Right.
Yeah. And Alex, just one last thing. I pulled up the last slide here. If there are any further questions that were not able to be asked, and they would like to ask either of myself or Mariah, they're free to email me at josephhousecenter@gmail.com. So any questions that those participating would like to ask, didn't get a chance to ask, please feel free to email me or email us.
Great. Well, thanks again, Father Dustin and Mariah, for presenting, and thank you to everyone who tuned in and joined us this evening. We will have a recording of this webinar uploaded to CatholicApostolateCenter.org and NBCCongress.org. You're welcome to share it with anyone you'd like. As always, all of the Catholic Apostolate Center's content is free to share. If you haven't yet found the Catholic Apostolate Center or the National Black Catholic Congress on social media, please like or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram in the hope that we'll continue to reach more people with spreading the message of the gospel. In the words of St. Vincent Pallotti, may the charity of Christ urge you on. Farewell, and God bless.